So, Pumi, I know you've been waiting to chat to our next guest. I thoroughly enjoyed my first conversation with him. His name is Dr. Alan Mendoza, and he is back because of popular demand and because he was so erudite about explaining what was going on in British politics the last time we spoke to him. He's the founder and executive director of the Henry Jackson Society, and he directs analysis, research-focused strategy and development for the organization. The last time I spoke to him, Boris was about to be kicked out. And we had a really interesting discussion. Of course, a lot has happened since then. And we're on to Prime Minister number 3 since I last spoke to Alan. Alan Mendoza, it's good to see you. How are you, sir?
Hi, Gareth. Yes, fine, thank you. Hope you're well too.
Very, very well. Pumi and I have been very keen to speak to you, and I'm glad that you could join us this morning. How many Prime Ministers are you expecting before the end of the year?
Well, at least as many as the Queen, the late Queen, saw through in her entire 70-year reign, it looks like at the moment. No, before the end of the year, I think we're done for this year. I think we're done.
All right. Well, let's start off with Rishi Sunak, who's become the new Prime Minister this week. He went to see King Charles at Buckingham Palace, and now he's going to set up a government of his own. Of course, the Conservative Party is still in dire straits. Just give us a little overview of Mr. Sunak, where he's from. Tell us a little bit about him, how he differs from perhaps his two predecessors, and whether or not he's got any hope in hell of holding this together.
Well, the last question is what everyone's asking. But look, let's start with the facts. I mean, this is the son of immigrants to the UK. He is Britain's first Asian origin Prime Minister. So that's a major transformation. Of course, his parents came from East Africa originally, so you might say there's an African connection there as well in that way. So quite remarkable story. His parents, arrived, worked themselves up. They were in the health service and in various capacities. They provided for him. Education was key to what they wanted. He went to a very famous British public school called Winchester, and he then went on to a stellar sort of academic career at Oxford and then at Stanford, and then, of course, famously into a career in banking. So he's had a very interesting upbringing from not very much to quite a lot. He then, of course, famously also has married the daughter of an Indian billionaire. So that is, of course, a subject of some discussion. Became an MP fairly recently, only in 2017. So this is not a long, or 2015, one of the two, but it's not a long time in Parliament before he actually rose to the heights. He, of course, famously was our Chancellor during the COVID crisis, and as such, doled out billions of pounds to everyone to sort of save feelings through the pandemic. So he's really, he's had an interesting background personally, educationally, from a family perspective, and of course, politically. Now, he resigned from Boris Johnson's cabinet, did not win the summer leadership contest. We had that very unusual Liz Truss interregnum when she took over and he lost it. It looked like his career was over in a sense. And then suddenly he's back in because basically everything he said would happen with Liz Truss happened. I don't think anyone realised it would happen as quickly as that. And now he's been turned to by the Conservative Party in the hour of need when the economy looks particularly damaged as a result of maybe what Liz Truss tried to do to it. But also, of course, the global situation that's going on, the commodity shortages, the war in Ukraine, the hangover from COVID, the inflation, the problems that we're seeing in many, many different countries. Britain, of course, has, and he's got to put that back together again now.
All right, so there are a few...
Liz, why do you think... I have a question about the Liz Truss. Why Liz Truss fell apart so spectacularly and so quickly.
There are many questions about Liz Truss. We've all been
But, I mean, she came in almost mirroring Margaret Thatcher, so very similar policies, very similar stance and talk. So why did she fall apart so spectacularly?
Because she wasn't mirroring Margaret Thatcher, that's why. So, you and I might say we're mirroring Margaret Thatcher by doing X and Y, but that's how she came in is not how Mrs. Thatcher came in. And I think she took the wrong lessons from the Thatcher era. It is true that Mrs. Thatcher fundamentally transformed the British economy and transformed the way we were trying to do business in this country. But she didn't do it on day one of her positioning in Downing Street. It was a long-term project that took multiple years to go through, and there was significant pain in that process, a little bit into the start of it. But it wasn't pain because of the way that she handled things. There were all sorts of structural problems in the British economy that she needed to undergo and remove. Now, the difference between her and Liz Truss is that Liz Truss came in basically and said, right, Thatcher did this, X, Y, and Z. I'm going to do it on day one. But she had forgotten that you have to, if you like, win the confidence of the financial markets to do these things. Thatcher in the early 80s managed to do that with a careful style of how she was doing things. Equally, people forget now, but in the mid-1970s, Britain, amazingly, had to go to the IMF, and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, bailed us out because we were essentially bankrupt. So they had already told us we have to do this, that, and the other. So when Thatcher came in, she was acting on IMF advice, basically. And so the markets were like, right, this is fine. This is what we've asked you to do, essentially. What Truss came in and did was actually long-term sensible, trying to restore the idea of growth into the economy, trying to cascade money down, trying to drive productivity. But the way she did it was completely wrong. She didn't bring anyone with her. She didn't check out the policies beforehand. And crucially, she didn't balance what she was trying to do on supply-side reforms and with tax cutting with the means to pay for those tax cuts. So she was essentially loading debt onto the economy. And that was not something the markets were going to appreciate, given the volume of debt already there. So it was a fundamental misunderstanding of what Mrs. Thatcher did, I think, that actually did for her in that sense.
Yeah, it's interesting that the markets kind of came to bear there, and people forget what an important force that is. Because when we talk about the markets, we aren't just talking about rich people with capital. We're talking about the consumers too, how much they're willing to pay, how much of an interest rate or an inflation rate they're prepared to accept. And people are taking a big hit at the moment. I mean, the cost of living crisis, as it's been named, is foremost in every politician's, or should be foremost in every politician's mind. I just want to go back to Rishi Sunak for a moment, because listening to you go through his CV very briefly, I mean, he sounds almost like the perfect candidate for the Conservative Party in some ways. He not only brings all of that elite institutional stuff which you need to have on your resume in order to be taken seriously in the Conservative Party, but he also brings, you know, a little bit of kind of second generation immigrant, first ever person of color in that role, stuff that the woke people on the left like too. So it might be in some ways a bit of a fresh breath of air for the Conservative Party. Do you think he's got enough support within the party, though?
Well, I think you're right first about your prognosis. This is a really interesting departure and a number of firsts for the Conservative Party. You've got someone who clearly is experienced in the economy, if you like. You know, he's held that position. He's had a background in it.
Right.
He is at least steep, particularly at the time when there is a financial crisis, etc., economic crisis. So great, we've got someone who understands that at the helm. He's got all those other firsts as well. That's going to carry him, a certain amount of the distance. But the problem for him was that he didn't win the last contest against Liz Truss. He lost it. So now he's come in because he's been proven correct, if you like. So there's some strength in that. But the Conservative Party has to look at itself very hard in the mirror and decide, are we going to get behind this guy who is the right man for this job right now? We can see that. And can we make sure he's the right man going forward as well? And that's a question they have to answer, because they have basically removed 2 prime ministers in this year already because they've lost confidence in them.
And Sunak is like sloppy seconds. I mean, he didn't win the vote. The other 2 dropped out. He's like sloppy seconds for them.
Well, no. In this case, it's not the other 2 dropped out. The other 2 couldn't get to the vote, and that's quite a different point. They didn't have enough support among MPs to get to the vote. And this is actually very important. I think the problem that happened last time was the MPs were not able to express a clear preference in the way that they voted. As a result, Liz Truss started with a lot of enemies, basically, people who were not backing her, and she didn't continue this well. She stacked her cabinet with loyalists, people who supported her, and sacked all her political enemies. Now, I don't need to tell you that if you've got a lot of enemies in the first place and then you sack them all as well a second time, they're not going to warm to you. They're going to try and bring you down. What Rishi Sunak has done, quite cleverly, I think, in his cabinet picks, is to bring all the different factions to sit round the table. He may not like X and Y. He may not like the person's stance on this or that, but he's brought them round the table to sit in and join in the cabinet. And that, I think, gives him a much better chance than Liz Truss, and actually, the end of Boris Johnson, of making a success of this and binding everyone to his policies. And that's what you've got to do as Prime Minister, bind people to your policies.
All right. All of this has happened without an election. We're not exactly sure how the British public feel about this. So it's an internecine battle in some ways in the Conservative Party. But what is happening with the rest of the political landscape? Have Labour even managed to take advantage of any part of this? Because the last time we spoke, Alan, you and I were both really quite shocked at how they hadn't managed to turn these obvious disasters in the Conservative Party into any kind of advantage for them in Labour. And has that changed at all, or is the Labour Party continuing its descent into stupidity?
Well, actually, the Liz Truss period was so damaging to the Conservatives that Labour had been able to take advantage in the sense the polls were showing remarkable advantages to Labour. I mean, we had polls that were 32, 33, 34 percentage point leads. Now, that's better than what Tony Blair achieved in 1997, if you're thinking about polling leads. So what Labour has, I think, managed to do is establish itself as a viable opposition now. People have been willing to say, you guys are terrible, and we think that you're safe enough that we will vote for you. Because it's interesting, they're getting the votes, not the smaller parties. So clearly people have decided in some way, shape or form the Labour Party is a party that they could support, they're interested and willing to support, and that is, I think, a big change for Labour from where it was, say, 6 to 8 months ago, where I'm not sure that was the case. Now, the challenge is, can Rishi Sunak pull that lead back, number one? Is it a soft or a hard lead? Because it might just be a soft lead that was just in revulsion of what the Tories were doing. If it is, then he's really in business, and then Labour have got a problem again. Or is it something that's going to be baked into the political system now for the next 2 years, in which case Labour will win the next election? But on that front, Labour still have not told people essentially what they stand for. And so I think a lot of this is actually soft support for the Labour Party that could go back if Rishi Sunak does a really strong and good job straight away. So I think Labour have still a lot of work to do to convince the British people that they're a real competent and I should say positive force for government rather than just the other guys who are going to vote for because you are so terrible.
I see that...
Sounds like Rishi, the problems we have here.
Yeah, well, it's politics, isn't it?
Yeah. I see Rishi Sunak reinstated the fracking ban in a massive government U-turn on Sky News yesterday. And people are also concerned about his ties to the World Economic Forum and the fact that, during COVID, we saw so many of these World Economic Forum deployees all over the world acting like petty tyrants. Is there any concern around him behaving something like Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand? And what do you think of this fracking ban? Because clearly that is going to create an energy crisis on top of an energy crisis.
So I think it's a shame that the fracking ban's come in because we've all understood in recent months, I think, that energy needs to be, kind of sought in whatever place you can find. If we have natural resources we can extract, we should be doing so rather than relying on external supplies of gas and oil. It doesn't mean in the long term you can't change your mix or look at, doing that. But the reality is that we are in a pickle. In fact, much of the world is in a pickle because we're having to import these natural resources. And as the argument was made recently, isn't it better, if you're going to use fossil fuels anyway, isn't it better to do it at home rather than shipping it over and doing, or where you can at least regulate it in that way? Look, that said, I understand why he did it. He did it because he is, in answering the sense to the previous question about, elections, he has come in, the third Prime Minister in a year, and of course Labour are saying, you've got no mandate. Who are you? The country elected Boris Johnson in 2019. What he has said is, no, the country didn't elect Boris Johnson. The country elected the Conservative Party and its manifesto pledges of 2019. And one of those manifesto pledges, to be fair, was no fracking. So what Liz Truss was doing essentially was changing that manifesto pledge that had been voted on by the British public. And I think what Rishi Sunak is trying to say here is, look, whatever the status of fracking, I have come to you on the basis of the 2019 mandate you gave my party. That's why I'm here, basically. So don't think I'm some bloke who's just been dumped into the, number 10 Downing Street by anyone. I've actually come through that party that you voted for, and we're going to keep to the manifesto that you voted for to give myself legitimacy. I think that's, quite a powerful thing. And I don't think, actually, interestingly, I don't think he is going to be pushed around by anyone in the sense of he was very keen to open up the economy during the COVID period. As you know, we had a big debate about how early do we open up, how late. And in the end, the people who wanted it early won out here and took over from, if you like, the sort of the health fascists who wanted everyone to be locked down forever. So I think actually his instincts on this are actually good, and he's not interested in listening to, the sort of the very hardline forces who want to keep people in check. He's interested, and he's always said he's interested in the idea of, kind of economic freedom. But what he said is, and he's right again, we have to do it at a time the economy can actually allow for that rather than other ways. We've got to build the ground for doing it, because right now, in the middle of 10% inflation, is not the time to run riot in this way.
And speaking of kind of power as well, one of the things that we know he's already done is he's already had his obligatory call with Joe Biden, and just talking about the kind of restating Britain's kind of commitment to sticking with America on this against Putin, and also to support the Ukraine.
By the way, I saw.
And what do you make
Biden,
of that phone call?
I saw Biden call him Rishi Sunak or something, because he didn't even get his name right the first time he said, "We've got a new prime minister." I mean, the guy's just completely out of it. So, what is this? What do
you make of his stance with Ukraine and Biden's relationship?
Well, obviously the Biden relationship is very important for the UK, whether he's awake or asleep. I mean, we have to, sort of be dealing with the US, whatever's going on, because, this is our indispensable ally. We do things together. The whole world knows the UK and the US tend to stand together. So it's very important you make the call to the US president to say, look, Britain is back in business. We remain, here. We remain your ally and partner on all these aspects of life, if you like. Here we are, willing to stand with you as usual in this kind of way. So it's, hugely important. And I think it's particularly important that Rishi Sunak made that call, because he's got very little experience in foreign and defence policy. If you look at his entire political career, it's been focused on domestic activity. But we're in the middle of a war in Ukraine, a sort of a global war that involves obviously Vladimir Putin challenging the entire international system. So it's not only symbolic but necessary for Rishi Sunak to present his credentials in this case and say, no, don't think I'm going to do anything different. I too am going to follow the line of Liz Truss and Boris Johnson, and to be fair, the entire British political class across parties, to say that what Putin has done is wrong. I will be pursuing sort of justice for Ukraine, and we will be doing all that we can to support that embattled nation in concert with our many allies who are doing the same. So it's a vitally important thing that he has kind of sketched out his policy on this, and obviously we're looking forwards to what he might be doing in that area. Particularly, a lot of eyes on the 3% pledge that Liz Truss made to raise defence spending to that level of GDP. He's not guaranteed that yet. It's going to be interesting to see whether he does guarantee it or not.
All right, so Pumi also indicated the Russia-Ukraine situation. What is your take on all of that at the moment? I'm increasingly getting concerned that we're ratcheting it up. We're making it more and more aggressive on both sides. The West has been unequivocal about its support for Vladimir Zelensky and the Ukraine. And what is happening in Russia, obviously, is that they're becoming more and more like a bear backed into a corner. I don't see a way out of this. Do you?
It's a very difficult situation in the way that you suggested, because I don't think there's any problem with the West standing up for Ukraine, given the free world is under assault, and we are the free world. We have to stand up for ourselves. We don't. History shows us that if the free world does not stand up for itself, the unfree world rolls it over, basically. And before you know it, you have the unfree world at your gates, basically. Better to stop it at its first infraction rather than its last infraction. As Churchill once said, the appeaser wants to feed the crocodile, hoping he'll eat him last, basically. Mm-hmm. That's the problem with appeasement. So we've got to stand up for that. And the Russian bear is poked into a corner, but it's been poked into a corner by its own idiotic activities. So it's the one that attacks Ukraine. It's the one that's now losing the war in Ukraine quite significantly. And we are worried, obviously, about the, where Vladimir Putin might take this conflict. Because it's difficult to see how he gets out of it now, isn't it? He promised a victory to remove the entirety of the Ukrainian regime. Then he scaled it back to, I'm just going to take over a few provinces. And now the Ukrainians are pushing him out of those provinces, which he claims are now Russia. This is obviously not a, kind of sensible way. Realistically, if you look at where we can go here, I don't think you're going to see a negotiated settlement, because neither side can negotiate a settlement when they, kind of can't afford to lose anything there. So your best bet, Gareth, to get out of this is that Putin is somehow removed from the scene. And I mean that, if you look at how this likely ends, it has to be with Putin either dying or being removed from power by people in Russia who are appalled by either his incompetence or by the direction of travel. And don't forget that, in the past, the Russians have done this. Khrushchev was a great example. Cuban Missile Crisis. He drags the world to the brink of nuclear war. He then loses the conflict with Kennedy, basically. And a couple of years later, the Politburo, bring him into a room and say, it's all over, Nikita, off you go to a small country, Dhaka, and we're replacing you with Brezhnev. So I suspect that, the way the war is, being lost at the moment, there may well be people, even on the hardline faction, who say this guy's failed us, or a collective of people saying he's failed us, we've got to remove him. And I think that the likeliest outcome of this in a positive way would be for Vladimir Putin to be kicked out of office somehow, because that would enable a different constellation to emerge and for the war to end, basically.
So if the war ends, do you reckon, the amount of debt that the Ukraine is now under, even if the war were to end today, can the Ukraine come back and come out of all of that debt? Will they be able to?
Yeah, I think they probably will. It's not going to be an easy process, but I think because there'll be a big reconstruction program, I think much like Marshall Aid in Europe after 1945, if you look at what happened, the US pumped billions into Europe to restore economies that were completely dead on their feet, basically, after 6 years of total war, and managed to get Europe up and running very quickly within 5 years, essentially. So if you have a plan, if you have the finance to do it, I don't see any problem with Ukraine coming back. Of course, it's been a terrible shock to their economy and to their system, but they will return, and there will be a way that they can do so. But they need the war to stop, obviously. They cannot do anything in the current constellation. They've got to have their territory back, their country back, and the ability to make decisions again without fear of Russian invasion.
Alan, it's always terrific to speak to you.
Okay, before you say goodbye to Alan.
Okay, go ahead, Paul.
I have one question before you say goodbye to Alan. The World Cup, and I know this is not a Gareth type of question, but the World Cup is around the corner. What do you think England's prospects are? This is important. Well, it's an important question.
Well, look, anyone who's an England supporter has known that for years it's dangerous to make predictions about England, and it's dangerous to dare to dream. But we came so close, in the last major championships. The team is still, bubbling along there. Hope springs eternal. We think it might be the time after, how many years is it? Nearly 50 years, 60 years. We're going to get there eventually and win the World Cup again and bring football home. You asked the right question.
Wow. All right, I'm glad you got that question in, Pums. And thank you, Alan. It's always terrific to have your insights into this really important stuff that's happening around. It's sometimes very confusing, and I'm sure not least to the people of Britain and to the Conservative Party and even to the Prime Ministers themselves. It must be very confusing. But thank you for helping us to understand.
The year of 3 Prime Ministers.
Absolutely.